It's always good to know who the strange priest is. I'm Father Bill Burke, and I'm the pastor of St. Marguerite Bourgeois Parish in Sydney, in Cape Breton, for the last 5 years. And before that, I was the director of the National Liturgy Office for the Canadian Conference of Bishops. This passage of Mark's Gospel today takes place exactly at the midpoint of Mark's Gospel. Jesus is now beginning to realize that people are turning away from him. They have been taught, as it's clear in Peter's response, they've been taught to expect a Messiah who will turn Israel into the greatest military and economic power in the world. Jesus, on the other hand, is preaching a kingdom of justice for all, of mercy, and a commandment of sacrificial love. There's not much power and clout to be found there, according to the people. But the problem with today's readings, and I've often heard it used this way, pick up your cross, whoever hates his life will lose it. It's been used to glorify suffering. And the first reading almost supports that by speaking of the servant being beaten and attacked, but still soldiering on for the glory of God. And then they were told to take up our cross, give up our lives for the sake of the gospel. These are very noble thoughts. But the problem is, I don't think any of us in this church thinks that suffering is a wonderful thing. I don't think any of us see suffering as a blessing. Suffering is not meant to be glorified. And I recall in grade 3, I was only 8 years old, we had a wonderful teacher. She was so good to us in all kinds of ways. She would never harm a child, except when it came to teaching catechism. She had a notion that we were all headed for shore on the way to hell unless she could scare the devil out of us. And she would do that in many ways. One of my favorite was every morning after prayer, she would say, "Now keep in mind that before the end of this day you might die. Make sure you don't commit a sin." Isn't that a wonderful way for an 8-year-old to face the morning? But one of my favorites as well, she was reading the story of the martyrdom of St. Lawrence, who after being beaten senseless was then roasted to death over an open fire. So after hearing all these gory details, Miss Lahey then tells us that all good Catholic Christian boys and girls would pray that one day they would receive the courage and the strength to suffer and to die for Christ. Now the fellow sitting behind me, his name was Charlie. I never met a man who could endure pain like him. He could get into a fight and break his nose, didn't flinch, didn't wince. So we're supposed to pray to be martyrs, and I remember my 8-year-old prayer. Dear God, I'd like to be a martyr for you, but I think Charlie would do a much better job. These readings should not be used to glorify suffering. Suffering is not good, but suffering is certainly part of life. As I said, Jesus is at the point, he's very aware that people are turning against him. They don't want the kind of kingdom that he's preaching and that he's calling them to. They want a kingdom of the world, money, power, force, control. The message of Jesus is falling on deaf ears, and they are starting to desert him. He's challenging the established religious and political ideas of the day, and they want no part of it. And here's the catch. Jesus did not seek suffering. He didn't go looking for it. But he couldn't avoid it. It was inflicted on him because he lived what he preached. He not only talked the talk, as they say, he walked the walk. He challenged the power structures of his day, the vested interest, and it cost him his life. He truly died for the sake of the gospel that he preached. But he died with complete trust in his Father, with hope in people, with a call to mercy and forgiveness, and a conviction that love would overcome hate. And now comes the rub for you and me in today's readings. He now calls on us to do exactly the same, to take up our cross and follow him and proclaim a gospel in a world that doesn't always like to hear it. In fact, a gospel that we often don't like to hear ourselves. To accept the vision of the kind of kingdom of world that God wants there to be. Let's not kid ourselves. It's not an easy task to live out the gospel. It's easy to accept the commandments. I mean that. It's easy, and not just for Christians, throughout the whole world. All manners of faith and people who don't even believe in God will say, you shouldn't kill, you shouldn't steal, you shouldn't lie. That's easy. We may fail in it, but it's easy to say, oh yeah, that's the way we should live. But the gospel goes much further than that. The gospel calls us to remake the world and our way of living in it according to the vision of God. If you hear what Jesus says to Peter, you're looking at things as humans do, not as the way God does. If you want to follow me, you better look at it the way God does. And that's where it gets tough. You know, there's been a group in the United States since the early 1950s. It existed a bit before that, but they've become quite strong in the last 70 years. They actually preach what they call the gospel of prosperity. Now, there's nothing wrong with prosperity, but this form of religion actually says, it preaches, that if your faith is real, God will make you rich. They actually say that. And the downside of that, it goes so far as to say that if you are poor, it's because your faith is weak. They actually consider the poor to be sinners. Well, compare that to the example that I'm about to give you. About 15 years ago, I went to a conference in Cleveland on initiation of adults, the RCIA. At one of the workshops, I met a young woman from upstate New York, a young black woman. She gave witness to how she, who had grown up in a family where there was no practice of any religion, how in her late 20s, she converted not only to Christianity, but to the Catholic tradition. She had received her MBA from MIT in Boston, and she got a job with this small company that had 60 employees. Her boss at that time was a man of about 60 years of age. And he told her his story because she came to him after 6 months. She was now the office manager. And she said to him, you're a great guy. I've come to have such respect and affection for you and your wife and your family, but you're not a good businessman. And he said, what do you mean? And he said, you don't need 60 employees. You can easily lay off 10. And with the salaries and the advantages that you provide, you could save $500,000. And she said, then he told me his story. He was born into a Catholic family in a small community in the Deep South where they were the only Catholic family. There was great prejudice against blacks, against Jews, and against Catholics. They lived in extreme poverty. He had a dream of going to university, but he knew he couldn't afford it. He ended up kind of being befriended by an old Baptist farmer down the road whose wife had died years earlier. He never remarried and he had no children. He took this young kid under his wing. He let him work on the farm after school and during the summer, and he paid him triple the wages that he should have paid him. And when the old guy died, just before he died, he sold the farm and he gave all the money to the kid and said, here, now you're going to college. And the kid said to him, how can I ever repay you? And the old farmer said, I don't know, but God will show you a way. This man went on. He went to the seminary thinking of becoming a priest, but after 2 years decided that was not what God was calling him to. Got married, had a family, and founded this very successful small business. And he said to her, I am a good businessman, but I am also a follower of Christ. My wife and I are very well off. We have more than ever we dreamed we would have. We don't need that $500,000, but those 10 employees do. They stay. That goes beyond the commandments of avoiding sin and of avoiding lying and avoiding cheating. That's, excuse me, that's changing the world in light with the call of the gospel to create a kingdom of justice, peace, and sacrificial love. And he said to her, God has finally showed me how to say thank you to that man who made such a difference in my life, and now years later, that makes a difference in the lives of dozens of people. The liturgy that we celebrate here calls us each Sunday to allow God to let us see reality with God's eyes and not our own. Because you see, that young woman said to us, that went against every principle I learned in school, every economic principle. But she said, then I realized there are other principles we have to follow as well. Property is good. Maximizing profits is good. But for how long, to what extent, and who is affected by those decisions? These are ethical questions, and they have to be asked in boardrooms. That's one example. This coming week during the parish mission, I'm going to address this issue of the liturgy calling us to see with the vision of God for a just kingdom. How does the gospel call you and me to take up the cross, follow him, and change the world, to accept God's vision for our world? You know, my parish in Sydney, we brought in a Syrian refugee family 2 years ago. They're still with us. At the meeting where we were planning it, one of our older retired priests challenged us and said, there are Christian families being persecuted in the Middle East. Why aren't you bringing in a Christian family? Why are you bringing in this Muslim family? I didn't know how to answer him, but an old nun in the parish got up and said, Father, we're not bringing this family in because they are Christian. We're bringing them in because we are Christian. It's who we are and what we do. So you see, when Jesus asks Peter today, who do you say I am? Let's realize that when we answer that question, when we say who Jesus is, it says a lot about who we think we are. It says everything about us and what we must stand for when we take up the cross and follow him. In the next 3 evenings of the mission, I want to explore that more deeply and how the liturgy calls us to us. It's very serious stuff indeed.